Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on Doordarshan, India's national television channel, about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and how India is involved in shaping a better world order and an improved planet. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up a monumental event in the contemporary history of India, the formation of the third successive government led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Modi 3.0 holds a lot of promise in domestic and international affairs. We're going to be looking at the foreign policy implications of Prime Minister Modi's third consecutive term and the challenges and the expectations in the international arena for Modi 3.0. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to a very knowledgeable scholar who is joining us in the studio, Dr. Shweta Singh.
Thank you so much, Professor Chaulia. Thank you for the warm invitation. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
Dr. Shweta Singh is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at South Asian University, the notable scholar on war and peace, on global politics, on gender and many other issues. Thank you for being on Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Dr. Singh, the whole world, it seems, and not just India, has been waiting in anticipation for what will be the shape and the form of the new government after the 18th general elections. And now we have it in the form of Modi 3.0. We saw the kind of outpouring of the congratulatory messages that came out from so many corners, from so many heads of state, presidents, prime ministers all over the world to herald Modi 3.0. And Prime Minister Modi also responded to all of them individually on social media, thanking them and vowing to further India's partnerships and friendships with so many of them. So, to begin with, it's quite clear that the world as a whole seems to be quite relieved and happy to see continuity in India, because probably they have such high expectations for India as a rising power, and because Prime Minister is so closely associated with India's image as an ascending power in the world. I think most of them are quite satisfied and happy, because they wouldn't have wanted a break, which meant going back to drawing board and working with a new set of people and a new regime. So there is no regime change in India, and in that sense I think the international community is quite content. So if you could start by talking about what you think is at present, how the world sees us, and how this is reflecting in their outlook towards Modi 3.0.
Thank you, Professor Chaulia. Very interesting moment in Indian history, I would say, or in the whole context of the act of storytelling of India's foreign policy. And I think it's a momentous, kind of a juncture, both geopolitically and geoeconomically. And if we are looking at this momentous juncture, both geopolitically and geoeconomically, India is rising, as you rightly said. And with the fact that India is rising, it's a resurgent India. I think what we need to wait and watch is how does Modi 3.0 actually script the story of this resurgent India. And I think it's a very interesting moment, because while there is continuity, we might also see certain departure points. And I think that's something that we need to engage with. So what is the difference? What are the departure points when we are thinking about Modi 3.0? Prime Minister Modi is back on the stage. Foreign policy is something that he's been articulating on different forums. India has a very unique identity when we are talking about the foreign policy spectrum. And if you're looking at it on that realm, there's a continuity. Because I think when we are talking about foreign policy, one of the important ideas connected to the idea of foreign policy is the question of self-identity. And I think India in the past 2 tenures of Prime Minister Modi has nurtured a particular identity for India, a rising identity which is marked by both ideas on civilizational exceptionalism and also strategic pragmatism. And I think the world is carefully watching it. So for instance, if you're looking at, markers of continuity, I'd be very curious to see, for instance, the context of Modi 3.0 in the context of India's neighborhood. For instance, if you're looking at the swearing-in ceremony, 7 different heads of states have been invited. Now, it's very interesting. Now, it's interesting as the world is watching. It's also interesting for us in terms of the region. So, if you're looking at it, if you're looking at the spectrum of ideas that's coming in, it's very interesting to see 3 heads of states who've been invited: Seychelles, Mauritius and Maldives, you know, and I think that I would say is such a continuity as well as I would say a leap forward in the context of India's maritime vision.
Yes.
So I think to begin with, I would say, I as a scholar would be very curious to see what is new that we would have in our neighborhood policy, because our neighborhood policy has been marked by neighborhood first, like India first, has been marked by the Sagar Doctrine. But what else would be scripted? And why I say this, you know, I mean, I want to qualify this. Why I say this is because this time Prime Minister Modi is not just the leader of the BJP, but is the leader of a coalition government politics.
Yes.
And I think if you're looking at Prime Minister Modi as a leader of a coalition government with two different regional partners, you know, Chandrababu Naidu and Nitish Kumar, it'll be very interesting to see how we are sketching this out in the neighborhood. So for instance, you know, some of the ideas that come back to me is, are the departure points also be in the context of, while there be continuity, are there going to be departure points, for instance, in the context of subnational diplomacy or para-diplomacy? So, for instance, Nepal has been invited. Now, it's very interesting to see how for Nitish Kumar, Nepal has been,
across the border,
you know,
right?
across
Bihar.
the border, you know, the state of Bihar, you know, shares a border with Nepal. We've seen how this has played out, for instance, in the context of regional politics. It also holds, so, you know, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out, even for the context of Chandrababu Naidu, I would say, you know. I mean, the fact that the whole act of entrepreneurial diplomacy that he brings onto the stage. So I think what would be very interesting to watch is, while there is continuity, will there be certain departure points?
And some additional elements that the regional you know, partners within the National Democratic Alliance might bring. That is certainly interesting. In fact, Prime Minister Modi was addressing the NDA you know, parliamentary group and was saying that the gap between the regional aspirations and national aspirations, he said, should be like almost non-existential, or it should be airtight.
Right.
And that, he said, is the ultimate goal. And always with coalitions in the past, especially before 2014,
right.
We had large unwieldy coalitions with so many partners tugging in different directions. And there was some fear about, you know, foreign policy losing direction, I mean losing track, because it is being held sabotage by parochial interests. So this time, of course, a stronger coalition sense. So definitely, yeah, the structural dynamic and it matters, and the national identity that you spoke about. I think Prime Minister Modi will try to maintain that, you know, the overarching national interest over anything else when it comes to dealing with the outside world. And probably that's what the world also expects. So yeah, and the states. But taking up some of the main themes of the Modi era now, you know, you already mentioned the neighborhood first and the swearing in. So 2014 we had the SAARC countries, and 2019 we had the BIMSTEC. This time we have a mixture, and including Indian Ocean countries that you mentioned. And one of the hallmarks of his diplomacy has always been to consolidate India's leadership role in our own sub-region. And I think that clearly looks like it's going to continue. And we may see new initiatives to integrate. There have been you know, sub-regional groupings that have come together, and inter-regional ones, BBI and BIMSTEC. We've been working on a lot of these permutations. So on that count, perhaps we'll see more movement. But there is also the question of the big powers, right? And always, because India is rising, how we handle the US, Russia, China, always these matter, especially US and China, because these are the great powers. And Russia, of course, is, you know, has been in decline, but it still matters because it's been historically an important partner for us. So there, Modi, the hallmark has been, and you've also written about it, to maintain a kind of a balance and to pursue our own hardcore national interests with all these important players. So if and the congratulatory messages, interestingly, have come from both the US and China. But there's been a bit of a flap because Prime Minister acknowledged the Taiwanese leader, his you know, congratulatory message, and the Chinese immediately got worked up and said that, you know, India needs to rethink its approach, and so on and so forth. So you can see that, you know, our relations with the US will any day be stronger and more you know, convivial than what we have with China. So can you talk a little bit about this, and what you think is likely to happen with this intensifying new Cold War between China and the US, and where we are going to position ourselves?
I think very interesting. I think what I really do see is a continuity of ideas of strategic pragmatism. I think Prime Minister Modi has absolutely, in absolute terms, foregrounded ideas of strategic pragmatism. And I think India has taken the way forward. Having said that, I think also there is a kind of a strategic balance that has been struck in the context of India's interests vis-a-vis two great powers, Russia and United States of America. So I think India has been able to leverage its own interests as well as its own identity in that context. Coming back to China in that context, and I agree with you, it's been very interesting to see how, you know, the Indian leadership has acknowledged the message from the Taiwanese leadership. But what is also very interesting is, if you look at the content of the tweet, both of the United States of America and of the Twitter handle of the Taiwanese premier, it talks about Indo-Pacific. And I think that's very interesting. So I think when we are talking about a new world order, when we are talking about this push for a new narrative, I think Indo-Pacific becomes extremely important in India's ways of looking at a multipolar security architecture. And I think that's where, you know, India is pushing for this whole idea of multipolarity. So while India is engaging with the US, I think the way India is engaging with the US is very different. And I think that's where, you know, I would say India's own identity, you know, India's identity as a rising power becomes extremely important. And I think India is also very cognizant of the fact of the politics of empires, be it of the United States of America or be it of the Russia. So while one is revisionist and one looks like a benevolent, benevolent power capable of taking care of the liberal order, but I think India has scripted a different kind of storytelling in that process. So I think if we're looking at India's engagement with great powers, there is a continuity. At the same time, there is also, India has been able to leverage its interest as well as balance its identity of the voice of the global south, the whole context of civilizational exceptionalism. So I think that's where, I do see a continuity, but I do also see challenges when it comes to China, because if you're looking at the context of China, there is definitely, how is it that India would be able to balance, leverage, what is the new emerging axis that we need to look at? It's very interesting to see, just very recently, we saw India signing the Chabahar port operationalization deal with Iran, and India has made strides in the context of its West Asian politics, So there is Iran, there is UAE, there is also the Arab countries. So
and
I
Israel,
think, there is Israel. So it's very interesting to see, it's when we look at international politics and we look at foreign policy, you'd agree that, it's like multiple chessboards. But how do you balance and counterbalance these different chessboards becomes extremely exciting.
Yeah, and perhaps the alignment that we saw in the first two terms of Prime Minister Modi, especially with the reinvigoration or the revival of the Quad, Japan, Australia, US, India, that certainly you mentioned the Indo-Pacific, and that's their theater, and that seems like a very significant move, a bolder move than before, because when earlier we were seen to be fence sitting, but now especially in the last 6-7 years, it's quite clear that we do foresee a challenge in the maritime domain and also in Asia as a whole, and we are up for that counterbalancing, and so there I think we may expect more friction with China, although Prime Minister has also mentioned during the election season that we would want to have stable and predictable relations with China. We don't want war. But then on the other hand, they have territorial ambitions, they have all kinds of claims, most of which are illegal, but then they also believe in using force to attain their objectives. So I think the one big question, especially from the Western countries that we are going to see in the Modi 3.0 is, how far will India go in aligning with us to counterbalance China, and that's always subject to a lot of debate in India. There's some who say we should go full throttle and treat China as the #1 adversary. Then there are others who say, well, we should not go too close to the Western countries because China is right next door, right? And on that count, any thoughts on what is the right balance to strike?
Difficult question, but sometimes I think, but it's important to take cognizance of the fact that India has always scripted a position from the standpoint of autonomy. I think, so, you know, aligning with any one strand of great power would be problematic from India's own, you know, this identity that India has scripted for itself. So, and that's something that we can see historically from 1947 onwards, you know, the fact that India was not part of different kinds of military alliances or otherwise, it was scripting a different story in terms of security architecture. But I think where I do see a departure point is, there is a difference in the idea of non-alignment itself, you know. There is this whole idea of multi-alignment that is coming in. So the fact that, you know, it's a difficult call to completely align with the United States of America, to counterbalance China, would also be in some ways undermining our own identity, you know, as a rising power.
Well, they say it's not really, it's not an alliance, but it's only an alignment, you know.
Interesting, yeah. It is an alignment, still it is an alliance.
Yeah.
So I think the counter strategy to my mind is the way India is playing out in the context of its maritime security architecture. And I think that's very interesting, because if we look at the Bay of Bengal, if we look at the Indian Ocean region, if we look at India's Indo-Pacific strategy, you know, all intertwined. And it's extremely fascinating.
And it's not only US there, there are many other regional powers with
absolutely.
whom.
So India has diversified its spectrum. You know, India is engaging, for instance, with Australia, or it's engaging
Japan,
with, you know, with Japan. So I think that security architecture has been diversified. And I think I would say that it's, as I said, you know, going back to my first point, when I'm looking at the security architecture in the context of the maritime domain, the fact that India has been able to get a deal in the context of Mauritius, for instance, you know, the ports that we are talking about.
That's right. Agalaga,
the Agalaga ports that we are talking about. The fact that, you know, I mean, and it's still working with Seychelles as a partner, you know, in the context of military alliances. Now it counterbalances, you know, the transit routes where China has an upper hand. So, you know, how is India, for instance, scripting its maritime security architecture plays a huge role in terms of counterbalancing China. So why just focus territorially? I think our vision is expanding, and our vision needs to expand, given the fact that it's a resurgent India. So how do we then actually start to pay greater attention to, you know, a more detailed, a more nuanced maritime security architecture? And I think that's extremely important.
Absolutely, and that's the way to position India also as a, you know, a separate power center that is distinct from China and the US, isn't it? So, yeah, and Shweta ji, there's also the question of the developing world. In the Modi era, we have in many ways revived the old ideas of India as a leader of the global south, but with a lot more heft and with a lot more economic weight than was the case, let's say, in the Cold War period and all that. So there we have the voice of the global south. We played an instrumental role in bringing the African Union into the G20 as a full member during our presidency. These are big achievements, and you see more and more praise and support for what India did during the coronavirus pandemic for developing countries through our vaccine, Maitri, all these things. And one can sense that a lot of countries look at India now as a role model. And so Modi 3.0, presumably we are going to press the accelerator more on this aspect of positioning ourselves as a leader of you know, the downtrodden of the world, and as also their voice, and also someone who tries to lift them up, not just through economic assistance or foreign aid and those sort of things, but also in diplomatic forums, bringing them in, you know, in a big way. So that seems like definitely a cornerstone of the Modi period, and that's going to continue, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think the challenge, or I think where I would say we need to move ahead, is translate these global voices in the context of global governance frameworks. And I think that translation is extremely important. I think there has been one set of translation that India no longer is a norm taker. It's a norm entrepreneur. We saw that with the context of the G20, for instance, you know, the whole context of women's-led development that was foregrounded. I think that was extremely interesting from the standpoint of the voices that we are talking about. But I think the challenge remains, how do we translate these voices in the context of the global governance framework? I think the second related point I'm going to say here is that there is a shift now. And the shift that we are really looking at is that there is a shift in the context of from balance of power to balance of technology. And I think here we need to see the intersections with Global South. So for instance, if you're talking about global governance frameworks on AI, or if you're talking about democratization of AI, you know, how do we actually bring in these frameworks, and how does India take a lead role in that context?
And we have the digital public goods, public infra DPI,
right,
which is our calling card,
right,
you know, for a lot of developing countries
right,
now. Yeah.
Right. The second would be, I would say, in the context of climate change and disaster management. You know, how do we bring in, you know, the differing frameworks? How do we then again foreground the voices of the Global South? And the third, to my mind, as you know that, you know, I have an interest in gender politics, I think India should take a lead in the context of really engendering the foreign policy spectrum. India has been talking about the departure points from feminist foreign policy and talking about a gender-sensitive foreign policy. And I think Minister Jaishankar has been talking about looking at a grand strategy, or looking at a genealogy of this grand strategy. And I would say there is a lot of you know, I would say there is a lot of ideational content in the Global South from feminist standpoint to build from. And we are not often talking about it, you know.
Yeah.
For instance, even in the context of India, you know, if you're looking at a genealogy of strategic thinking, we often talk about, for instance, the Kautilya's Arthashastra, or we go back to certain strategic texts. But there are voices like the Terigata, which is really talking about, you know, or Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussein's feminist utopia, which are talking about ideas of peace. Now, how do we actually build those frameworks, you know? How does India play an important role in the context of the politics of knowledge production? Because I think that's where, you know, when I'm talking, so, you know, I mean, these may seem disparate, but these are actually interconnected, you know?
And they help an indigenous voice or an indigenous perspective that is distinct in the world.
And also the departure points from the knowledge spectrums that is coming from the global north, because you know, the politics of hegemony, the politics of knowledge economies that we are talking about, so these are all interconnected. So I think India's leadership, for instance, in the context of technology, or in the context of climate change, or in the context of gender politics or knowledge, these are all intertwined in the context of translation of these differing voices in the global governance frameworks.
I mean, often these are seen as very intellectual concepts, and that foreign policy, they say, is the art of the pragmatic and just, you know, dealing with countries the way they are. But certainly India, we say, is the world's largest democracy, one of the most successful democracies in the world, as our 18th general election showed. So there are many things that perhaps we can, you know, these spread these norms much more than a closed dictatorial country like China, for example. So yeah, the point's well taken. Shweta ji, there is also the question of how the foreign policy can benefit ordinary Indians. This has been one of the big, you know, thrust areas of the Modi 1.0 and 2.0. And always the question is, especially with trade and investment, how can our foreign policy bring more benefits for ordinary Indians through, let's say, free trade agreements, bilateral investment agreements, and in every major partnership that we have, Prime Minister has always pushed for, you know, greater foreign investment to come into the country. At some point, I think 2022, we even hit record inflows of FDI, but since there has been some adjustment and a downward flow. So I think there is going to be a lot of onus again on this developmental foreign policy that brings concrete economic benefits to our people, right, through trade and investment. And a lot of the international community have been waiting, and they have been saying after the Indian elections, maybe India will move faster on these agreements which have been negotiated but have been you know, stalled for a long time. With the EU, for example, we have big FTA and so many other, you know, partners. So foreign economic policy, how do you think it's going to go, and how proactively should we be doing this?
I think, I agree with you. I mean, foreign economic diplomacy or foreign economic policy is extremely important. And I think I'm going to come back to the point that I think this is where we need to translate this. A lot is happening, but how do we actually translate it nationally and locally becomes important. And I think that's where, again, I'll go back to the first point that I was making. I think the world would be watching, we would be watching. How does coalition politics impact or facilitate this process? For instance, you know, if you're looking at, and I'm going back to the example of Andhra Pradesh again, to, you know, during his first chief ministership, Chandrababu Naidu was very active, in the context of bringing in investment and aid. He would, for instance, attend the World Economic Forum. We all know what he did to the capital state of Hyderabad. We now also know the Sao Paulo model. So would that be translated in the context of Amravati, in the context of Singapore? So, I think what would be also we need to closely see is how does the center and the state balance and work together in the context of translating of these common economic goals, which are now part of a coalition agenda.
Right.
And I think that's where, the translation would also happen locally or at the state level. And I think it will be extremely important the states on board would be looking at the translation of this. So as you said, so the coalition politics would bring in both its opportunities as well as challenges. And I think that's where, I really want to say, Professor Chaulia, and I think all of us as academics or people who are working in it, we always say India offers very unique kind of analysis for foreign policy. Things we don't really see, for instance, in the context of Western models of federalism. So I think the Indian case in Modi 3.0 would be very interesting to watch in the context of strategic partnerships in the field of economic diplomacy, the translation of those strategic partnerships, and also the counterbalancing and balancing of the center-state relations on that count.
So viewers, what we've been discussing with Dr. Shweta Singh is that Modi 3.0 will obviously reflect the Prime Minister's vision and ambition to make India a leading power in the world, and there's just no doubt that it's going to continue on those lines. But there's also the structural change, the dynamic, which is a coalition government, and we'll need to watch out for some of those factors. As far as the external world goes, they are anxious to continue and to carry on doing business with India and to partner with India in geopolitical and in economic spheres, and they probably are quite anxious to see how these next 5 years will go, because they are counting on India to be up there among the major powers in the world that is going to reshape the world order. Let me thank Dr. Shweta Singh for intellectually stimulating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
So viewers, Modi 3.0 is going to have continuity with change. There is going to be a lot of focus on neighborhood, on great powers, on India's leadership of the global south, but also possibly more innovations on foreign economic policy and trade and investment related matters. Ultimately, the goal is to pilot India's ascent. Prime Minister has set the goal of India as a developed country or Viksit Bharat by 2047, and parallelly we have the goal of India as a leading power in world politics by that time. So this is the very crucial period, the next 5 years, and we are starting on the right note with a lot of leaders of neighboring countries present at Prime Minister's third oath-taking ceremony, and we very much hope that this momentum with foreign policy, he starts on day one of every term with foreign policy, and this is no exception. 3.0 is no exception. So we will hope that foreign policy will remain one of the shining symbols of Modi 3.0 as we look forward to the next 5 years. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.